If you walk through Times Square right now and look up at the national debt clock, you will see a number spinning so fast that it looks broken. 36.2 trillion. And it is heading toward $38 trillion before the end of 2026. To put that into perspective, if you tried to pay off $38 trillion by handing over $1 per second, it would take you 1.2 million years. If you stacked $38 trillion in $1 bills, the pile would be 2.6 million miles high. That is 10 round trips to the moon. For decades, economists told us not to worry about this number. They said deficits don't matter because we owe the money to ourselves. They said the debt is manageable as long as the economy grows. They treated the national debt like points in a video game. A big number that looks scary but has no real consequences. They were lying. In 2025, the math changed. We crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. For the first time in American history, the U.S. government is now spending more money on interest payments on the debt than it spends on the entire Department of Defense. Think about that. We are spending more to pay bondholders from the past than we are to defend the country in the present. We are spending more on interest than we spend on Medicare. The interest bill alone just hit $113 trillion per year, and it is going up. This creates a phenomenon called the debt spiral. In a normal household, if you have too much credit card debt, you stop spending, you cancel subscriptions, you cut back, but a government cannot do that. Most government spending is mandatory. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt. These are legally required payments. The government cannot cut them without changing the law, and no politician will vote to cut benefits because it is political suicide. So instead, the government borrows more money to pay the interest on the old debt. It is like taking out a new credit card to pay the minimum balance on your existing credit cards. This increases the total debt. Higher debt means higher interest payments next year. Higher interest payments require even more borrowing. It is a mathematical feedback loop that ends in collapse. Here is the terrifying part. There is no conventional way out of this trap. There are only 3 ways to deal with a debt this large, and 2 of them are impossible. Option 1 is austerity, massive spending cuts and huge tax increases. To actually balance the budget, the government would have to either cut all spending by 30% or raise all taxes by 40%. That means cutting Social Security checks by 1/3 or doubling your income taxes. Neither is going to happen. Any politician who tries gets voted out immediately. Austerity is political suicide. It is off the table. Option 2 is default. The government could walk up to the microphone and say, "We are not paying. This is what Argentina did. This is what Russia did." But for the United States, this is the nuclear option. The entire global financial system is built on the idea that U.S. Treasury bonds are risk-free. If the U.S. defaults, every bank on earth becomes insolvent overnight. The global economy collapses. Credit cards stop working. Gas stations close. It would be a financial apocalypse. So default is also off the table. That leaves only one option, the third option. The option that every dying empire in history has eventually chosen. Rome did it. Weimar Germany did it. Post-war Britain did it. It is the path of least resistance. It is called the soft default. You do not refuse to pay the debt. You pay every single dollar of it. But you pay it back in money that is worth much less than when you borrowed it. You print the difference. You inflate the debt away. And in the process, you inflate away the savings of every American who trusted the system. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is official policy. It is happening right now, and you are the one paying for it. In the next section, I'm going to show you the 3 specific tools the government is using to steal your wealth without you noticing. We are going to break down financial repression, CPI manipulation, and the captive buyer system. These are the mechanisms of the great wealth transfer. This is how they make $38 trillion disappear, by making your paycheck disappear. To understand how the government plans to make $38 trillion vanish into thin air, you do not need a finance degree. You need a history book. Because we are not doing anything new, we are running the exact same playbook the United States used after World War II. And it worked. The question is whether it will work again. In 1945, the U.S. national debt hit 119% of GDP, the highest in American history. The government had borrowed massive amounts of money to fight the war, and everyone assumed we would spend decades paying it off through higher taxes. But that is not what happened. Instead, the government used a trick called financial repression. For the next 10 years, from 1945 to 1955, the Federal Reserve artificially capped interest rates at 2.5%. Meanwhile, inflation was running at over 6% per year. Do the math. If you owned a government bond that paid you 2.5% interest, but your cost of living was going up 6% per year, you were losing 3.5% of your purchasing power every single year. The government paid you back every dollar it owed you, but those dollars bought half as much groceries, half as much gas, half as much housing. Over 10 years, bondholders lost almost 40% of their wealth in real terms. The government did not pay off the debt. They transferred the cost to the people who had lent them money. The debt to GDP ratio fell from 119% to 66%, not because the government paid anything back, but because they inflated the value of the debt away, and bondholders could not escape. There were laws preventing you from earning higher interest rates. It was illegal for banks to pay you more than 1% on savings accounts. This was called Regulation Q. You could not move your money overseas because of capital controls. You were trapped. Your savings were being confiscated in slow motion, and there was nothing you could do about it. This scheme worked for 10 years, but eventually people figured it out. By the 1960s, Americans started buying real assets to protect themselves: stocks, real estate, gold. By the 1970s, inflation spiraled out of control, and the Fed had to raise interest rates to 20% to kill it. Today, the government is trying the same playbook, but they have upgraded the tools. They have learned from the mistakes of the 1970s, and they are using 3 modern mechanisms to trap you more effectively than ever before. Mechanism 1, the captive buyer. In a free market, if the U.S. government is $38 trillion in debt and running $2 trillion deficits every year, investors would demand very high interest rates to lend money. They would say, "You are a terrible credit risk. I want 8% or 10% interest to compensate me for that risk." But the government cannot afford to pay 8%. If they paid 8% interest on $38 trillion, the annual interest bill would be over $3 trillion. That is more than all the income taxes collected in a year. The government would go bankrupt. So instead of paying market rates, they rig the game. They create captive buyers. These are institutions that are forced by law to buy government debt, no matter what the interest rate is. Here's how it works. After the 2008 financial crisis, the government passed new banking regulations. Basel III, Dodd-Frank. These laws were sold to the public as making banks safer. But buried in these regulations is a requirement. Banks must hold a certain amount of high-quality liquid assets, or HQLA. And guess what counts as a high-quality liquid asset? U.S. Treasury bonds, by definition. This means that banks are required by law to buy Treasury bonds, even if those bonds are a terrible investment. Even if the bonds pay 2% and inflation is 5%, meaning you lose 3% per year, banks have to buy them anyway. It is not optional. If a bank does not hold enough treasuries, regulators shut them down. The same thing happens to insurance companies. Insurance regulations require them to hold safe assets to back their policies. Treasuries are classified as safe by definition, so insurance companies are forced to buy them. Pension funds face the same trap. They are required to hold investment-grade bonds, and treasuries are 8AA rated, no matter how much debt the government has, because the rating agencies assume the government can always print money to pay you back. The result? Approximately $12 trillion in U.S. government debt is held by institutions that are legally required to hold it regardless of whether it is a good investment. This creates artificial demand. It keeps interest rates lower than they should be, and you pay the price. Your pension fund is not buying government bonds because it is smart. It is buying them because the law says it has to. And when those bonds lose money, your pension benefits get cut. The government is forcing your retirement account to lend it money at rates that guarantee you will lose. Mechanism 2, the broken thermometer. If you want to pay someone less money, but you promised to pay them based on inflation, the easiest trick is to lie about what inflation actually is. Social Security payments go up every year based on something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If CPI says inflation is 3%, Social Security checks go up 3%. Treasury inflation-protected securities, called TIPS, also adjust based on CPI. Government pensions adjust based on CPI. So the government has a massive financial incentive to report the lowest possible CPI number. They do this through something called methodological changes. These are technical adjustments that sound boring but are actually just fraud. Let me give you 3 examples. First, substitution bias. The old method of measuring inflation used a fixed basket of goods. If you bought steak every week and steak cost $10 per pound, the CPI tracked the price of steak. Simple. But in 1999, the government changed the methodology. Now, if steak goes up to $15 per pound, the government assumes you will stop buying steak and switch to hamburger at $6 per pound. So instead of reporting that your food costs went up 50%, they report that your food costs went down 40% because you are buying cheaper food. This completely ignores the fact that you wanted steak, not hamburger. Your standard of living went down. But the CPI says you are better off because you are spending less money. It is insane. Second, hedonic quality adjustments. Let's say a new car costs $40,000 this year. Who decides how much a backup camera is worth? The government does. And shockingly, the government always decides that quality improvements are worth exactly enough to offset most of the price increase. Third, they changed how they calculate the average. They switched from a simple average to something called geometric weighting. The effect is that items that are going up in price the fastest get less weight in the calculation. So the CPI automatically reports lower inflation than what you're actually experiencing. Add all these tricks together, and the official CPI is running about 2 to 3 percentage points lower than reality. If the government reports inflation at 3%, the real number using the old 1980 methodology is closer to 6%. There are independent organizations like ShadowStats that calculate inflation using the original methods. They consistently show inflation double what the government reports. Why does this matter? Because over 10 years, if the government reports 30% cumulative inflation but the real number is 60%, your Social Security benefits have lost half their purchasing power. You're getting paid in full, but the dollars you are getting buy half as much. The government is gaslighting you about the cost of living to save money on its obligations to you. Mechanism 3, fiscal dominance. For decades, the Federal Reserve was independent. The Fed's job was to protect the value of the dollar. If the government spent too much money and caused inflation, the Fed would raise interest rates to fight that inflation, even if higher rates hurt the economy. Even if higher rates made it more expensive for the government to borrow, the Fed did its job. But once government debt gets big enough, the Fed loses its independence. This is called fiscal dominance. The debt becomes so large that if the Fed raises interest rates high enough to actually kill inflation, it would bankrupt the government. So the Fed stops fighting inflation. It starts serving the treasury instead. We crossed into fiscal dominance in 2020. Here is how you know. The government spent $5 trillion more than it collected in taxes during COVID. Who bought the $5 trillion in bonds to finance that spending? The Federal Reserve did. The Fed created $5 trillion in new money out of thin air and used it to buy government bonds. This is called monetizing the debt. It is printing money to fund government spending. And when foreign countries like China and Japan started selling their treasury holdings, who stepped in to buy the bonds they were selling? The Fed did. China's treasury holdings have fallen from $1.3 trillion to $770 billion. Japan's holdings have fallen from $1.3 trillion to $1.08 trillion. Foreign demand is collapsing. But treasury yields are not spiking the way they should be. Why? Because the Fed is buying the bonds that foreigners are selling. This is the captive buyer system in action. The Fed cannot let interest rates rise to their natural level because it would destroy the government's budget. So the Fed keeps buying bonds, which creates new money, which causes inflation. The result is an everything bubble. Stock prices disconnect from reality. Real estate prices disconnect from reality. Your 401k goes up, your house value goes up, but it is a mirage. You have more dollars, but each dollar is worth less. The value of your assets is rising in nominal terms, but not in real terms. And here's the trap. If you keep your money in a savings account earning 3%, while real inflation is running at 6%, you're losing 3% per year. Over 10 years, you lose 30% of your purchasing power. You are the one paying off the national debt. You are the lender. The government is the borrower. And they are paying you back in money that is worth 30% less than when they borrowed it. The only way to escape this system is to stop holding dollars. You have to own assets the government cannot print. Real estate, stocks, gold, commodities, Bitcoin, things that go up when the dollar goes down. But here is the dark part. Not everyone can escape, and that is by design. This wealth transfer is not hitting everyone equally. In fact, it is the primary driver of the wealth inequality that is tearing this country apart. To understand why, we need to talk about something called the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon was a French economist in the 1700s. He observed that when new money is created, it does not spread evenly through the economy like rain falling on everyone at once. Instead, the new money enters at a specific point, and the people closest to that point benefit. The people farthest away get hurt. When the Federal Reserve prints $3 trillion, where does that money go first? It does not get mailed to you. It does not get dropped on Main Street. It goes to Wall Street. The Fed buys bonds from JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and BlackRock. These institutions get the new money first, and they get it at zero interest. What do they do with this free money? They buy assets, stocks, real estate, bonds, artwork. By the time this new money trickles down to you in the form of wages or stimulus check, prices have already gone up. The rich got the money before inflation. You got the money after inflation. This is why wealth inequality has exploded since 2008. The top 10%, the people who own stocks and real estate, have seen their wealth skyrocket. The bottom 90%, the people who earn wages and keep money in savings accounts, have seen their purchasing power collapse. The national debt is being paid off by liquidating the middle class. Here's the math. The bottom 50% of Americans by wealth hold about $3.7 trillion in total assets. Most of that is cash, savings accounts, and small retirement accounts. If inflation runs at 5% per year, while their savings earn 2%, they lose 3% per year. Over 10 years, that is a 30% loss. That is $1.1 trillion transferred from the poorest half of Americans to the government through inflation. The middle 40%, the middle class, hold about $38 trillion. A lot of that is in retirement accounts and home equity. But $8 trillion is in bonds and savings accounts. If those lose 3% per year for 10 years, that is $2.4 trillion transferred from the middle class to the government. The top 10% hold $93 trillion, but most of that is in stocks, real estate, and businesses. These are inflation hedges. They go up when the dollar goes down. The rich lose money on the bonds they hold, but they make money on everything else, and if they have debt, they win even more. If you borrow $10 million at a 3% fixed rate and inflation runs at 5%, you're paying back the loan in dollars that are worth less every year. You effectively reduce your debt burden by 2% per year just by waiting. The ultra-wealthy, the top 0.1%, hold almost no cash or bonds. Everything is in real assets. They borrow at low fixed rates. They invest in things that appreciate. They profit from inflation. Over the next decade, this system will transfer approximately $5.6 trillion from the bottom 90% to the government and the top 10%. This is the largest peacetime wealth confiscation in history, and it is happening right now. It is disguised as supply chain issues, corporate greed, and bad luck. But it is deliberate policy. The end game, the final solution. But the government has one more tool they have not deployed yet, and this one is the most dangerous. It is being built right now in the basement of the Federal Reserve. It is called a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. Right now, the government's ability to control your money is limited by the existence of physical cash. If the Fed sets interest rates at negative 2%, meaning they charge you 2% per year to hold money in the bank, you could just withdraw your cash and put it under your mattress. Physical cash is the escape hatch. It is your freedom. A CBDC removes that escape hatch. If the dollar becomes purely digital, the Fed gains total control. They can implement negative interest rates instantly. Your bank balance goes down 2% per year, whether you like it or not. They can put expiration dates on money. Your stimulus check must be spent within 60 days or it vanishes. They can track every dollar you spend and block transactions they do not approve of. This is not science fiction. China is already doing this with the digital yuan. They can see every transaction. They can turn off your money if you do something the government does not like. If you donate to the wrong political cause, your money stops working. The digital dollar is the ultimate solution to the debt crisis. It gives the government the power to devalue your savings with a keystroke. It removes your ability to escape. The transition to a cashless society is not about convenience. It is not about stopping crime. It is about ensuring that when the great wealth transfer accelerates, there is no exit. The verdict. The United States is defaulting on its debt. It is a slow, quiet, polite default. But it is a default. The $38 trillion will never be paid back in real terms. The government is going to inflate it away. And you are going to pay for it. The winners will be the people who own scarce assets. Real estate, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, businesses. Things that cannot be printed. The losers will be the people who trust the system. The people who keep their money in savings accounts. The people who buy long-term government bonds. The people who believe the official inflation numbers. The people who think the government will protect them. The American dream of saving your way to prosperity is dead. We are now in a game of asset survival, and the rules have changed. If you are not paying attention, you are already losing. But there is one more chapter to this story. One more tool the government has used in the past when inflation gets out of control. In 1933, when the debt spiral was spiraling and the dollar was collapsing, the United States government did something unthinkable. They made it illegal to own gold. They sent federal agents door to door to confiscate the one asset that could protect you from their money printing. Executive Order 6102. If you did not turn in your gold, you went to prison for 10 years. In the next video, I'm going to tell you the full story of the great gold confiscation, the secret trials, the people who got caught, the people who escaped, and the legal precedent that allows the president to seize your gold, your Bitcoin, and your 401k during a national emergency. You need to know if your safe is actually safe. Smash that like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.